In watching several urbanist YouTube channels, there's one topic which rarely gets any cover. The cause of US sprawl is subsidized fuel prices. If we were paying $9 or $10 a gallon, similar to the EU, then this problem of stroads and strip malls and lack of rail investment wouldn't exist. The whole comment is pretty good if you want to pause the video. And I do want to get into the differences in fuel cost and taxation between the US and EU countries.
Hey everyone, hope everybody is doing well. I am doing this critique video on CityNerd. Now before I begin, let me introduce myself. My name is Cyrus. I have been a critic and advocate on urban planning since 2007. I've been following his channel. And while I do appreciate many of the issues that he's addressed, particularly in Sprawl, keep in mind I am the local chapter leader of Strong Towns Las Vegas, and he's done a lot of clips and analysis on the Las Vegas area. The issue is that a lot of his viewpoints seem to be pretty partisan, believe it or not. And I think a lot of his views often go too far. Believe it or not, a good amount of these urban planning channels tend to be pretty Democrat leaning. They seem to have a certain style of where they look, act, the way they talk, kind of like those folks that you see in NPR. And look, I don't think it's an issue to take a side. However, when we want to unite our society, when it comes to these urban planning issues, it is important that we have a message that wins with most of the population. Nevertheless, I think a lot of these people just simply don't care. I'm not surprised if a lot of these people, like obviously Ray from CityNerd, just simply hate the people that are in a different political aisle. Either way, he talks about gas prices, and look, I am not a fan of subsidies, and I understand that there's an issue where it's wrong to be really dependent on low gas prices. We've had a lot of spikes in gasoline prices for the last 25 years, as well as the 1970s, not to mention the fact that so-called alternatives like electric cars have had plenty of issues. And of course, I do support transit. There are obviously benefits in terms of efficiencies, lower personal costs, and so forth. But then again, what is he really advocating? He's talking about that we need to obviously increase gas prices as they've done in many of these West Coast states like California, which disproportionately harms low incomes, consumers, increased costs on businesses, and so forth. When you think about it, it's sort of like forcing people to kind of push a certain interest, which then obviously makes people want to lose interest in the solutions and ideas that folks like Ray are talking about. Now, keep in mind, though, that one of the reasons why the U.S. obviously has lower oil and gasoline prices is because the U.S. produces a lot more oil. It's certainly energy independent. Not to mention, a lot of these so-called subsidies, which really what they are is mostly tax breaks, is due to environmental costs and so forth. Now, he will also talk about how stroads and all these landscapes are very, very inefficient, costly, unattractive. The list goes on, which I will have to give him credit. But the real main cause of that is obviously the codes, the policies, the zoning, which actually ends up creating a lot of the car-dependent sprawl that we have now. Of course, obviously if gas prices get really expensive, it will wake people up and encourage policy change, but I don't think that that's the most effective way to do it.
I'm not going to widen the scope of this video to talk about all the things the US government does to keep the price of gas artificially low, which it presumably does because we've managed to construct a built environment that just won't allow society to function without cheap gas. I'm talking about things like publicly funded research into fracking, foreign wars, propping up petrol state regimes, Like, it may not be hyperbole to say that inexpensive petroleum is an addiction that our elected officials put an incredibly high priority on satisfying at basically any cost. And keep in mind, when I say cost, I'm not just talking about foregone tax revenue. I'm talking about the cost in terms of contribution to climate change, in terms of land use patterns that contribute to bad health outcomes and social isolation. You could even say antisocial behavior. Cost in terms of way too many people dying on our transportation system every year. All of this gets to the real question for today, which is, are the costs of owning and operating a car in the US just artificially low? Or to put it differently, in bending over backwards to make driving as cheap as possible, have we stacked the deck against Urban?
Later on in this video, yes, he's done a pretty good job addressing the problems in Henderson here in this valley. Now, of course, just to let you know, instead of just criticizing, I am taking action. Several videos ago, I talked about how I've bought some vacant land in a newly rezoned multifamily area. I'm looking to do infill project, but that's a topic for another day. True, we certainly don't want to pick winners and losers in this economy where government policy favors another. Obviously, sprawl would have not happened without lower gas prices, but somehow to just spike higher gas prices is not necessarily obviously the ultimate solution. Certainly, yes, pollution, which he doesn't talk about, has been coming down. Yeah, there are a lot of different costs. But once again, he does bring up a lot of talking points, which does alienate a lot of people. He's talked about climate change. Keep in mind, though, after all the lockdowns and masks and jabs we went under COVID, people are not much of a believer in that as much as they were about 10 years ago. He talks about, oh, well, these low gas prices is one of the factors in pedestrian deaths because of our dependency on it. But in reality, a lot of that has to do with car design. Roundabouts certainly do help. Street design. All of these things matter.
So let's talk a bit about how gas taxes work in the US, or maybe more accurately, how they don't work. First of all, the federal gas tax is 18.4 cents a gallon. Note that this is a bit weird in that it's a tax per gallon and not a percentage of the price you pay at the pump like a sales tax would be. Taxing on a per gallon basis is consistent with the idea of a Pigovian tax, but note that it's not great as the primary source for funding transportation infrastructure and maintenance. The rate hasn't changed since 1993. It isn't indexed to rising fuel prices or any kind of inflation. And cars, on average, have become more fuel efficient over time. So as a funding source, it's kind of a perfect storm of inadequacy. Each US state also has its own fuel tax, so when you put that on top of the 18.4 cents, the weighted average across all 50 states is 56.4 cents. On a macro level, if you multiply that by the 135 billion gallons or so that Americans consume every year, that's about $70 billion in tax receipts, which is sort of a lot of money, but in terms of funding a nationwide transportation system, kind of questionable. Now let's take the Pigovian view and just look at the externality of traffic deaths. We have something like 40,000 of those in the US every year. Now, estimating what the monetary value of a human life is fraught, to say the least. It's kind of worth doing a whole other video on, probably not on this channel. But the number you'll hear most often is $10 million. 40,000 times 10 million is, well, it's a lot of zeros. It's $400 billion. So combined federal and state gas tax revenue in the US is woefully short of accounting for just that one very specific externality. And I didn't even mention severe injuries or property damage from crashes. I didn't talk about secondary effects like health impacts of a sedentary, car-dependent lifestyle or asthma and even worse diseases from pollution. I haven't talked about noise or the visual blight and opportunity cost of enormous stroads and parking lots or contaminated runoff from all the impervious surface that's required. and I certainly haven't talked about climate change. Keep in mind, a fuel tax is a blunt tool for trying to price in every possible externality of our transportation system. It doesn't account for the time and location of your driving, which is something you could do with a congestion charge. And it doesn't really account for vehicle characteristics that worsen pollution and safety issues. But on the flip side, a gas tax is administratively simple and more intuitive, which is probably why a gas tax exists just about everywhere and congestion pricing doesn't. So if the question is driving in the United States underpriced compared to the externalities it generates, I really don't think it's much of a question.
Sure, there are plenty of issues with this urban planning system. To somehow think that raising cost is obviously the answer, no. It would be absolutely absurd to bring people a burden in order to encourage other types of lifestyle. And by the way, over time, as we're starting to find out that gas taxes are not becoming as relevant, there's talking about a mileage tax. Now, of course, depends on how it's done. Let's talk about an area that has really jacked up gas prices here in this country, and that is in California. Basically, he's trying to push his climate change agendas, which, again, there's been lots of pieces of evidence that prove otherwise. We've had an ice age during the Middle Ages. It was warmer during medieval times. Not to mention, he tries to make you feel discomfortable for having different points of views. Let's talk about what has been really happening when California has been putting all these cap and trade higher gas taxes. A lot of it has been pretty wasteful, going to port projects. We have seen, not to mention, it has disproportionately hurt low incomes. Much of the funds go to bloated government salaries and pensions. People have been moving out of the state. He uses that as an excuse to promote transit-oriented development, but as we've seen in a lot of states like California, these projects have taken a lot longer and more costly than they should. Let's not just forget, they're not talking about the economics. These people believe in a certain lifestyle where they want to have fewer kids to save the earth.
I really want to spend this next part talking about climate change specifically and how the United States and the European Union approach it differently with fuel taxes. Let's just acknowledge up front that, for whatever reason, climate denial is a dominant aspect of mainstream American politics in a way that it just really isn't in the EU. They have climate deniers, but for whatever reason, they aren't nearly as politically powerful as ours. Let's talk about the Kyoto Protocol, which was ratified by EU nations and was signed by the Clinton administration, but shocker, was never ratified by the US Senate. Oh, and I'm not really talking about Canada today, but you all withdrew from the protocol in 2012, so get off your high horse. Anyway, it would take hours to talk through the details of the Kyoto Protocol, but in essence, it's a global strategy to reduce carbon emissions with heavier obligations on developed nations that are historically most responsible for the current level and trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions. Is the Kyoto Protocol perfect? Of course not. It's political. It's a negotiation, and the math and the science in it are pretty complicated. But it was apparently good enough to be signed by every single UN member state, except for the US and Canada. Okay, let's get back to fuel taxes because this is one big way the EU is looking to achieve Kyoto Protocol objectives by internalizing the externalities of transportation, including GHG emissions. The primary document for this is, I believe, the European Union Council Directive of October 27, 2003, which lays out the details of the tax scheme. The directive sets a bare minimum of 36 cents, meaning 0.36 euros, per liter for petrol, which many EU nations can and do exceed. You know, as an American, trying to translate gas prices in other countries is always confusing because you have to account for the exchange rate and the fact that everyone else is on the metric system. Well, there's 3.8 liters in a gallon, and the euro is sitting around $1.10 US, so that translates to about $1.50 a gallon. Remember, that's the bare minimum, and it's around 10 times what the US federal government mandates. When you look at the weighted average of what EU countries actually charge for petrol taxes and compare that to the US weighted average, including all state gas taxes, it's a little less pathetic, but the EU taxes are still something like 4 or 5 times higher. But we aren't done yet. Remember, the EU has a value-added tax, or VAT, which is something around 20%, which does apply to petrol, while in the US there are just a handful of states that subject gas to a sales tax, and it is definitely not a 20% tax. And I haven't even talked about how much it costs to own a car in the EU. You pay the VAT on that as well, so that's a chunk. And if you're in like Denmark, the registration fee for a new car can be like 150% of the sales price or even more. And there's an annual green tax that might run you a couple $1,000. If this sounds like a dystopian nightmare, go tell that to the Danish, where they're consistently ranked as one of the happiest countries in the world. Okay, let's bring this back for one more global comparison. Here's a nice bar chart of all the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD countries, and what they charge for fuel taxes. I don't know that this accounts for state fuel taxes in the US, but it's grim either way. Imagine being an American who drives a huge pickup truck or SUV and complaining about gas prices. When you at least make a real attempt to account for externalities in the cost of driving, you do get what you see in the EU. Less driving and more funding available to invest in things like better walking and biking infrastructure, abundant and frequent transit service, and really great intercity rail. The US, on the other hand, bends over backwards to keep the price of driving artificially low. But it's not as if the true costs of driving just go away. They're still there. It's just that instead of the people who are actually driving getting taxed at an appropriate level, we shift those costs to people who don't drive. You bear the cost in terms of worse transit service, more hostile land use patterns and street design, increased disease, injury, and death, and I don't know, just basically wrecking the planet for future generations.
So somehow, in order to make a happier country, we just have to raise cost of living for other people. Maybe there's a lot of other factors that we could do to improve urban planning, or maybe there are other factors why Americans are not so happy. Maybe it's the declining of social trust. Maybe it's the mass media. Maybe there's a lot of other issues and perhaps other factors that's certainly not related to urban planning. Now, while he does make some great points, however, keep in mind, though, that he shows a lot of these areas in Europe, but these are mainly focused in particularly in the inner urban areas. Not to mention, I've spoken to many people from England, and we do get a lot of British tourists here in Las Vegas, and many of them tell them that they depend on cars to get around. So not all European countries are very transit oriented, like Netherlands and Germany and France. And keep in mind, though, that still a very high portion of households in Europe do own cars. Nevertheless, I again don't believe that raising taxes is necessarily the solution. What you really need is significant code reform, such as removing parking requirements, zoning, building setbacks, street design. The list goes on.
Urban growth boundaries aren't perfect, but paired with the right supporting land use policies, they can be effective at curbing low-density development. And honestly, we need to use every tool we can to stop that kind of development because it bankrupts our local communities, harms the environment, and increases traffic congestion. So it just makes sense.
This just to show you that CityNerd, Ray, is not alone. There's many individuals like this guy of City Beautiful who has a very similar style in how he looks and his viewpoints, his approach, and so on. basically, urban growth boundaries, while they sound pretty reasonable, the thing is that they do limit freedom. Many studies have shown that urban growth boundaries can actually raise prices of homes, although it may not be the main cause for a lot of markets. But hey, I have to tell you this. What is so devastating about having a bunch of large lot homes scattered across a certain area? Certainly, it's not the same thing as just giant parking lots with commercial areas. That makes more sense, or non-residential. Besides, if you really want to reduce the impacts of unattractive sprawl, just get rid of a lot of the codes that enable it. It's very, very simple. Because after all, you have to learn how to win with the people. It's simple as that.
I can also see from a conspiracy nuts perspective how the 15-minute city eco-apartheid and stuff like that. I mean, it also has, unfortunately, this term, a lot of sort of outrage, conspiracy marketing potential. It's kind of like how the vote counting machines were operated by, like, Dominion was the company's name.
Right.
It's just a company name, whatever. But like the name itself has, of course, massive conspiracy nut potential. And I think with the 15-minute city as well, because it's numbers, it's scary. Like, conspiracy people find numbers generally scary because, numbers are communism, especially when they disagree with them, that is Jewish. So I think this is just an unhappy coincidence into which companies like ExxonMobil and interest groups like, the Koch brother, singular, and other climate change deniers, etc., just like piled in. Now, there is, of course, a large number of genuine crazy people who just think that the communists are out to get them, the Jews are out to get them, and the 15-minute city is their latest tool to bring down Western civilization, heterosexual white males, etc. But then again, a massive part of this is just being astroturfed by big-moneyed interests like the oil companies, because the 15-minute city cuts into the bottom line of these giant corporations.
Yeah.
And this is the bottom line, really. This is why I think it will not go away, this conspiracy wave, because these corporations, they are, of course, incentivized to eliminate as many threats to their profits as possible. And the 15-minute city currently is, I would say, one of the most severe threats to giant oil corporations, like big oil, let's call it.
Well, I think the thing is, I started my channel because we moved to the Netherlands, and it was basically an explanation of why we gave up on North America and why we wanted to live in the Netherlands. And ultimately, the reason was because we have a better quality of life here. And so you think here is moving from a place that should be, if you listen to the car industry propaganda, it should be utopia, right? Like, my hometown should be utopia. Everyone has a car, everyone has multiple cars, everyone can drive everywhere they want. They never need to get cold or wet or anything else, and it's going to be this wonderful place. But the truth of the matter is, it actually kind of sucks to sit in traffic all the time. It really sucks to not be able to, like, literally not be able to feed yourself without getting in a motor vehicle. Like, you need 2 tons of steel to feed yourself. It's ridiculous.
Love to have my life behind a paywall.
Exactly. That's exactly right. I think that's exactly the right term. It's like having your life behind a paywall. Whereas when we discovered that we could live somewhere where we can literally do whatever we want with a short walk or maybe a bike ride, anything farther, we can hop on a train or a tram or something, and we can even get a car if we want to. I mean, it's not like it's not allowed. It's just I don't drive very often, not because I don't like driving, not because I hate cars, but just because why would I? It's way more convenient to walk, cycle, or take public transit than it is to have to get in a car. And so the fundamental thing with my channel is that this way of living is better. It's better for a lot of people. It's actually better for most people, I would argue, even the people who have to drive because there's less traffic. So this is a better way of living, but it's inevitable that if everybody lived this way, there would be a lot fewer cars sold and there would be a lot less gasoline sold. And that's just fact.
Oh, yeah.
Look, they have a lot of good points about the whole 15-minute scare, fear-mongering, all this other stuff. I understand that the current urban planning system, Sprawl, has been heavily been pushed by the governments for decades through codes, regulations. Not to mention there's a lot of lobbyists going on. However, keep in mind, though, yes, I am aware of the whole United Nations Agenda 21 craze that happened 15 plus years ago. Nevertheless, what this podcast fails to talk about is that there has been a lot of environmentalists, like I've mentioned before, greenwashing campaign that's been going on for this whole anti-sprawl urbanist movement. A lot of these elements have essentially hijacked the whole alternative urban planning movement. Now, keep in mind, though, walkable, traditional, transit-oriented development used to be the case 100 plus years ago. So while people say that, well, we drive a lot because we want to, it's not really true. The codes and policies came in, lifestyle began to change. So what we really have in a lot of our cities is not really due to popular choice or market demand. It's just simply what the policymakers and everybody tell us to do. Yes, it's true there's a lot of environmental meddling, and I understand that the whole frustration behind the whole 15-minute fear-mongering and the concern about it. I understand that there are some limitations, urban growth boundaries, and so forth. Like, I have essentially addressed many of the arguments made by CityNerd. However, keep in mind, though, that if we had these things that were dominant 100 plus years ago, we would be living in a tyrannical state, but we were not.
We promised ourselves never to make another video about 15-minute cities. The conspiracy theories about people being locked inside their homes and unable to travel are just so far out of left field that it's hard to engage with them like any normal disagreement.
I gotta give this YouTube channel, the Urbanity, a lot of credit. You know, he's made some good videos highlighting a lot of urban planning issues. He's debunked one of the most largest defender of sprawl, Randall O'Toole. And he has obviously delivered his message in a not-so-partisan fashion, unlike other YouTube channels. In this video, he often will talk about the benefits of walkable urbanism, not to mention how he sees the so-called 15-minute as a net plus, but also he has talked about how cars, which was a video that was removed or deleted, how it can also lead to tyranny. You know, when it comes to limiting on what you can build, street design, parking requirements, registration, tickets, whether it's a whole list of other factors like taxing. You know, basically just owning a car can come with a lot of different government outreach. So it may look like you're free, but you're really not as free as you actually think. Now let's transition back to CityNerd, where this guy will even admit that the Democrats are failing in many of the goals and aspirations he advocates for, particularly housing.
If you pay attention to the housing supply crisis at all, you're probably well aware that they're building new residential like gangbusters in cities like Dallas and Houston, while our expensive, high-demand, supposedly progressive coastal cities almost seem to be going backwards. The reasons for this are complex and they vary from city to city, but I want to talk about one particular element that's in my wheelhouse, which is the traffic studies and impact fees that come into play in the development permitting process. You see, in my consulting career, before I started YouTube, I worked on a lot of city impact fee programs. I worked on a lot of traffic studies. You might even say I'm part of the problem. Well, today, just consider this a form of me doing penance. And what I want to do is try to add some depth and nuance to this idea you hear a lot, which is that cities in red states like Texas are easy to build in, but trying to build housing in states like California is expensive and slow and involves way too much bureaucracy. And actually, I'm going to use Oregon for most of my progressive state examples here, just because it is the state where I have the most familiarity with the development requirements. But my top line answer to this whole question is that building housing in blue state metro areas is time consuming and expensive because those cities have much higher standards for urban amenities in the built environment, where cities in red states are going to have relatively minimal development requirements. They really just want you to build housing and not contribute to improving the public realm because the places where they're building building housing are places where it's expected that everyone is going to drive anyway. This is an overly simplistic explanation. There are plenty of walkable places in Texas and lots of places in California with terrible urban form. But in terms of development requirements, I think it's roughly accurate, and what I want to do today is expand on that idea and look at how it plays out in practice.
Well, to be fair, recently a lot of red states like Texas, Florida, and many others, as well as blue states, have kind of loosened up their housing regulations that allow all sorts of housing to be built. I'm not going to dispute the idea that some codes aren't helpful, as a matter of fact. But keep in mind, though, we had fewer codes and regulations 80 plus years ago, and we had more walkable, human-friendly urbanism. So this doesn't mean that all the codes and policies that these blue states put in are all that even necessary. Not to mention, you need all the bureaucracy, the long permitting, all the other process that comes, which could take several times longer than typically found in a red state.
And to do that, I'm going to talk about 3 transportation-related aspects of development requirements. So keep in mind, this is just a small subset of the overall picture. The 3 things are: 1, frontage improvements, so improving the public realm where the development is located. 2, transportation impact studies, which may result in off-site traffic or safety mitigations. And 3, system development charges or impact fees. They're called different things in different states. It's basically a developer contribution toward funding the infrastructure projects that are needed to accommodate future growth. I'll get into detail on each one of these elements, but first I want to talk about the legal basis for all of this, which is very US specific. If you study or practice planning and development in the US, you're gonna learn about the legal doctrine known as the Nolan-Dolan standard. What is Nolan-Dolan? It's case law. In Nolan versus the California Coastal Commission, the US Supreme Court said that there needs to be a rational nexus between the impacts of a development, in this case, a loss of public view of the Pacific Ocean, and the required mitigation for development approval, which in this case was a public easement along the beach. And SCOTUS determined there was no rational nexus. The development's impact and the Commission's required mitigation of it weren't sufficiently related. In Dolan versus the City of Tigard, Oregon, SCOTUS went further and said there needs to be a rough proportionality between development impacts and mitigation requirements. In this case, overturning the city's requirement that the plaintiff, a home improvement store owner, dedicate right-of-way and construct a public greenway to mitigate additional traffic and stormwater runoff. The cases themselves are fascinating, but what I want you to keep in mind is that terminology, essential nexus and rough proportionality, and how it establishes limits on what the government can ask of developers and what constitutes an illegal taking. Okay, back to development requirements. So I'm going to use Portland as an example. Over time, the city has expanded development requirements in order to meet climate, equity, and quality of life goals. This comes in a lot of forms, but let's talk about frontage. The city has adopted street standards that nearly always require wider sidewalks and more generous planting or furnishing zones than what the existing condition is. These are good things. They support walkability and mode split targets that are consistent with the city's climate goals, but they do come at a price to developers. Not just the expense of upgrading the public realm, often including stormwater and utility relocation, which are not cheap, but also in terms of right-of-way dedication, which cuts into the developable acreage and makes it tougher to get projects to pencil out. Let's talk about traffic impact studies. Just about every city requires some form of this for developments bigger than a certain threshold, and Portland is no exception. Essentially, the city wants to know, is the development you're proposing going to trigger new traffic or safety issues? So you have to go out and hire a licensed traffic engineer, go through a whole scoping process with the city, collect all the traffic data at all the locations the city wants you to study, and then analyze whether the estimated new traffic from your development is having level of service or queuing impacts on nearby intersections, or if you're adding traffic to locations that have safety issues, or introducing new safety issues. The list goes on and on. Traffic studies are not cheap, And if they find significant impacts to the transportation system, then you're going to be on the hook for mitigations like new turn lanes or traffic signals. Not cheap. And number 3, system development charges, or what they call in most other states, impact fees. They're one-time charges that are meant to represent a development's proportionate contribution to the funding of future projects in the city's capital improvement plan. And in Portland's case, they have SDCs for environmental services, basically sewer, parks, transportation, and water. The idea here is that the need for additional capacity in each category is driven by new development. There's a whole bunch of modeling and math that go into setting these rates. And then in the case of transportation, the rates are per dwelling unit for residential and per square foot for just about every other use. And all the rates are derived from land use trip generation estimates from the Institute of Transportation Engineers. There are a couple overlay areas in the city where you pay higher rates because of higher capital needs, but in general, if you want to build a 100-unit apartment, the transportation SDC alone is going to run you a little over $300,000, and that's in addition to frontage dedications and improvements, any off-site mitigations identified in the traffic study. And I'm not trying to say they're bad things. At minimum, they have a essential nexus and rough proportionality with the impacts, but I will get into some nitpicking later. So let's zoom out a bit. I don't want to be too hard on the city I've called home for most of my adult life. Portland actually made the national news in a good way a couple weeks ago because of the success of the residential infill project, a code update that allows development of middle housing, so duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, on land that was previously zoned exclusively for single family. In general, they're smaller homes, typically priced at hundreds of thousands of dollars less than existing housing stock, and they're now the most prominent housing type being built in single-family zones, with most of the production happening in very walkable, very bikeable, relatively well transit-connected inner East Portland.
While the process sounds very reasonable, then again, the process goes too far. It encourages more housing scarcity. Not to mention, you get a lot of problems that are associated with, with high cost of housing, which means, people have to work longer hours, work a second job, commute longer. They have to delay having kids. People start moving out of the areas. This is where a lot of these blue states demand more immigration. And remember, when it comes to the red states, it's not just difficulty building outward that these blue states experience, but even the red states have an easier time to build vertically upward. Okay? And as a result, this system is very costly. And by the way, to counter this whole scare tactic that they're trying to basically pack us up into dense units, well, if they really wanted us to live in a stack and pack environment, they wouldn't make this so difficult. Then again, this guy really admits that the party he tends to lean on makes things a lot harder and more difficult.
This is about NIMBYism though. NIMBY, not in my backyard for the uninitiated. They don't like anything to be built near them, least of all, more housing. Because to me, this is the essence of NIMBYism. You think of your home more as an asset than you think of it as an integrated part of a growing, evolving community. And when a lot of your net worth is wrapped up in a single asset, you'll have nothing more than a situation where demand keeps increasing and supply is kept in check. I think we all have an idea of what NIMBYism is and how NIMBYs behave. They show up at public meetings and city council hearings to block housing proposals and comprehensive plan amendments. Number 10, Livermore, California, on the periphery of the Bay Area. Get ready for a procession of very charming but low density and expensive cities. Lowest vacancy rate on this list, 2.3%, which is nearly impossible to achieve and a testament to the molten hot demand, but I guess they're kind of done building housing here. I didn't use this as part of the analysis, but this housing data app website is kind of amazing. It helps you visualize how much or how little housing a city has been permitting by year. My census data said Livermore was up a whopping 850 units in 10 years. That's net, so construction minus teardowns, so the permitting looks pretty consistent with that astonishing number. 9, Mission Viejo, California. Let's see, median rent in 2022, around $2,800. Vacancy rate, second lowest on this list at 2.8%. All indications are that demand is super high, so they built more housing, right? Well, the census data actually says Mission Viejo is down 500 housing units from 2012, so that's probably not helpful. The housing data app doesn't really offer any glimmers of hope in the permitting pipeline. I don't want to come down too hard on Mission Viejo though. I mean, sometimes you just have more important things to do with land than, I don't know, doing your part to help solve the state's housing crisis. 8, San Leandro, guess which state. Also negative growth in housing units, down 250 over the 10-year period. And this is while rents are up 66% and the vacancy rate is about 3%. Very normal and cool situation. I mean, to be fair, they've probably maxed out the amount of housing density you can put around the San Leandro BART station. This is what it looks like when the guiding principle of your housing policy is to protect the investment value of existing homes by suppressing any kind of new supply. And then the same people probably wonder why the Bay Area in particular has such a high population of unhoused folks. Just a masterpiece of cognitive dissonance. 7, let's get a big city in here. It's San Jose, the highest population municipality in the Bay Area. Relatively flat housing growth, check. Low vacancy rate, check. Rents spiraling out of control. Home values around 1.4 million, up about 2.5x over 10 years. And I just want to point out that between 2012 and 2022, the population of San Jose actually decreased. Just imagine that for a minute. In a city that looks like this, that has every possible indicator of blistering hot demand, blinking bright red, and you just can't see your way to building more than just a modicum of additional housing supply. Just seriously grim stuff. Number 6, Hayward, California. The highest percentage growth in rent and in home values over the 10-year period. So surely they're falling all over themselves to build more housing in what's obviously a high demand area. Luckily, unlike San Leandro, Hayward has 2 BART stations, so they really have an incredible opportunity to build density where it can do the most good. So surely the station areas aren't surrounded by low-density housing and surface parking lots. Surely not. Number 5, let's change it up radically and go to the peninsula side of the Bay Area. It's San Mateo, highest median rent of anything on this list, around $2,900. And look, I've been pretty sarcastic about all of these because they're all ridiculous, but you can legitimately see a lot of newer housing in San Mateo, especially around the Caltrain stations. But the net increase is only about 2,000 units over the 10 years I looked at, and this is in a city of over 100,000. Every city in the Bay Area is supposed to be doing its part, theoretically, and maybe San Mateo isn't the worst offender, but it's still just way short of what's needed. Number 4, Fremont, California. Rent's just slightly lower than San Mateo, and home values are lower too, but increasing faster, and I just can't get over the aerials of these BART stations. Fremont Station, there's a hospital, fine, that's a pretty solid trip generator. But then enormous expanses of impervious surface for park and rides. Apparently the highest and best use in a city that's got every possible indicator of white-hot demand for housing. South Fremont Station, acres of prime opportunity land all around the station, so I have a lot of viewers in the Bay Area. One of you smart people should let me know down in the comments what the plan is here, and if it's anything other than thousands of additional park and ride stalls, I'm gonna be very disappointed. Okay, you probably want to pour bleach in your eyes after just being subjected to all that. But in a minute, I'm gonna give you an example of a city that's kind of doing the opposite of what all these cities are doing. And then I'm gonna follow that up with the 3 absolute worst, including the city that I'm gonna crown NIMBY Town, USA. Usual brief reminder to click on all the stuff, connect on all the apps, etc. You know what to do. So everything we've looked at so far is pretty extreme, but California cities are really just the worst examples of a dynamic that happens in nearly every US city. But before we get back to it, let's cleanse the palate by looking at a city that has the opposite of all these characteristics. And it's Madison, Wisconsin. I'm not saying Madison is the anti-NIMBY city, but I am saying that there's a pretty strong demand for housing here, as evidenced by the low vacancy rate and the fact that housing supply is up 27% over the 10 years in question. Median rents went from $867 to $1,260. pretty reasonable increase, actually a bit lower than the national average. Home values are up 85%, so homeowners are doing fine. It all just seems so balanced and reasonable. Madison, tell us your secrets. Okay, that's your brief respite. Before we get back to the madness, I just want to let you know there were actually 22 cities that met all the threshold criteria to make this list, and numbers 11 through 22 are also all in California. So if you ever wonder why California is ground zero for the YIMBY movement, I think this video pretty much answers your question. Okay, let's go to number 3, Union City, California. The diversity of locations on this list is just stunning. Zillow Home Value Index of 1.2 million, around triple what it was 10 years previous, so extremely cool for the homeowners. And I'm not going to recite all the other metrics, but I know you're all dying to see what the Union City BART station area looks like, and I am not going to disappoint. There are DART stations way out in the Dallas suburbs that have like an order of magnitude more housing density than this. Just bonkers stuff. Number 2 on the list, let's hop back across the bay to Redwood City. Crazy high rents, spiraling out of reach, home values through the roof, and the city addressed all this latent demand for housing with like 1,600 net additional units over the 10 years we're looking at. Honestly, probably a lot of them around the Caltrain station from the look of it, but not nearly enough to make a dent in the Bay Area housing crisis. And just for reference, most of Redwood City looks like this, so draw your own conclusions. And the number 1 NIMBY Town 2024 title holder, Sunnyvale, California. Outrageously high rents, an outrageously underwhelming amount of housing added in the last 10 years, and a Zillow Home Value Index of a little over $2 million. Again, they've managed to build some new density in close to the Caltrain station, which is better than what you see at the BART stations on the other side of the bay. But once you get away from the station areas, this is what Silicon Valley is, and I assume this is what you want when you've got a $2 million house that practically tripled in value in 10 years.
There you have it. Almost all of the cities are in California, and almost all of them are relatively blue cities. Democrats are typically the most NIMBY type people that you'll find. They will typically block housing or make it more difficult to expand the supply of housing vertically or horizontally, upward or outward. And it's no wonder why they're projected to lose seats, believe it or not. Yet this guy keeps aligning with them politically. It's just really, really hard to believe it or not. Yet on the other hand, it also kind of shows that this idea that we keep hearing that these environmentalists, these types of voters, whatever you want to call them, are trying to stack us up in high density housing, which is really, when you see how tough it is to build upward, you'll find out that it's really not all that true. Well, they want you to build vertical through their strict guidelines. That's pretty much what it seems. Now, to give credit where it is due, Mission Viejo was on the top 20 list. My first job I ever had was in Mission Viejo because I lived in Laguna Niguel. If you remember my earliest videos, and oh boy, I've been trying to battle these people because they were blocking new housing. And believe it or not, I think Mission Viejo's a planned city is one of the worst I've ever seen. Mostly tiny lot homes and one of the most car-dependent areas, full of subdivisions, cookie cutters, strip malls, car-dependent, and they took that valuable land and wasted it.
Because it's not lost on me that the most reliably popular videos I make are the ones where I talk about places that have good transit, that are walkable, bikeable, and that are relatively affordable. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about why that is. And I think it really comes down to people want to be in a place where they can be true to their values and be less car dependent. And there simply aren't enough of those places that you can afford if you make any kind of normal wage or salary. I'm going to recommend this piece from Salim Firth on the Market Urbanism website, which explores two different claims about the housing shortage. One, that the aggregate number is 4 million, the other 20 million. It gets into some wonky stuff about the varying methodologies. The article is from 2022, and you might be asking, given that it sounds like the floor is 4 million, why is Vice President Harris only proposing to support the construction of 3 million new dwelling units? That question is a little out of scope for today, but I'd just point out that the Harris-Walz proposal is for 3 million more dwelling units than you'll find anywhere in Project 2025 or Agenda 47 or whatever you think it is that a Republican administration would actually do.
Here we go again. Another one of these anti-Trump videos. Remember, he is talking about how, okay, we need affordability, but to live in blue cities, which we've shown before how blue cities are the worst offenders when it comes to affordability, because he admits that their policies have a significant impact, the bureaucracy, the opposition, urban growth boundaries, the list goes on. Not to mention he's giving a lot of hope for Kamala Harris, from the last election that we had. But can we all remember, isn't it true that Newsom, who ran in 2018, promised that he was going to build millions of homes? All these false promises. And why did this problem get so bad under Biden? Come on. If Biden was in charge, he could have built more homes. He could have pushed more NIMBYism. Because this is just to tell you, Democrat cities are among the worst offenders. By the way, this should not be a partisan issue when it comes to building denser housing, believe it or not. But anyway, his approach is just so partisan. A lot of people just don't buy what he has to say, and then the problems we have, including sprawl, continuously get perpetuated. Not to mention his climate change push, or a lot of the other guys like him continuously do so.
If you haven't realized by now, what I'm talking about is YIMBYism. Yes, in my backyard for the uninitiated. I think this is the first time I've ever said the word YIMBY on this channel. Not because I'm not on board with the cause, but just because it's kind of a goofy sounding word. But it is easy to grasp. Everyone knows what a NIMBY is. It's someone who would prefer that their neighborhood was frozen in amber, and maybe on a deeper level, they want to keep the supply of homes low so that their own home is worth more. YIMBY says the opposite. Having more neighbors is good. More density means more urban amenities, more viable businesses, a more vibrant neighborhood, and all those things, not to mention the ability of an individual to have more freedom to build what they want on their own land. Well, all those things make for a richer society. Okay, so we've established that housing supply is in fact an actual problem, and we still need to talk about the really meteoric rise of YIMBY as a political movement, how it's playing out in our politics currently, and how you can get involved. But first, all the usual ways to engage the channel and connect on the apps. Also, if you're watching this on or before Wednesday, August 28th, there's a very important live online event happening that evening. It's being put on by Yimbys for Harris, and it's going to feature an amazing variety of very cool speakers. US senators, big city mayors, people dressed up in bee costumes, even YouTubers who talk about cities and transportation, apparently. So I don't know if you're aware of how prominent the housing crisis has become in the Harris-Walz platform, but it was pretty evident at the Democratic National Convention. I am a very big Harris supporter for more reasons than I can count, and the focus on bringing down the cost of housing is just one more thing. You can learn a lot more on the call, and I am going to attempt to stream the whole thing on this channel while I'm also participating on the call, so wish me luck. Okay, and I mentioned earlier that this video came from a viewer topic suggestion, which is probably understating it a bit. The fine folks at YIMBY Action reached out about me doing a video around the housing affordability crisis and talking a bit about the work they do.
Again, it's just all more pandering when you think about it. Believe it or not, these Democrats should call out other Democrat politicians and voters who are so heavily NIMBY. But we all know that these people who have these events, they just bring up talking points to get their own voters riled up, despite their track record. However, keep in mind, though, that a lot of these blue voters, they want to prevent dense housing, keep single-family zoning, because they want to prevail and preserve their high-income environments. Or as a matter of fact, perhaps they think it's going to keep their neighborhoods mostly white, but yet these are the party of pro-diversity, and therefore allowing these migrants to come in and stay, believe it or not.
U.S. Representative Robert Garcia, who introduced the bill. It's very straightforward, and I'll just paraphrase. In the case of a newly constructed or substantially reconstructed residential, retail, commercial, or industrial structure that is located not more than half a mile from a fixed guideway transit stop, the owner of such structure or project shall have the sole discretion to determine how many automobile parking spots to provide. There's a little more to it, but I love the simplicity. YIMBY is having an absolute moment. It's deeply gratifying to be part of it, and I encourage everyone to get involved. It really is our time.
Look, folks, this really should not be a partisan issue. As a matter of fact, not only red states have made some efforts on housing, but North Carolina passed a law, got unanimous support, all the legislatures, to remove parking requirements. Not to mention, I don't really believe that you have to have federal involvement, because I try to just stay away from that. Sure, it's going to help. Keep in mind, a lot of this housing that this guy constantly promotes, I would prefer it would be more of a better quality, traditional looking style, because then it would reduce the chance of getting opposition and certainly would be overall more attractive.
Do you prefer fascism, meaning the end of the democratic experiment, which has produced more freedom and more opportunity for more people than any other political system ever devised, or streets that have 5% more litter on them? It's meant to be a little provocative. I mean, I'm pretty skeptical that fascism would even have the desired result. And what I hoped it would provoke is some introspection on how quote-unquote clean you really need a city to be, and what you'd be willing to give up to get there. Well, apparently trash collection is the third rail of urban politics because this was basically ratioed, which is another way of saying this is the first time any of my posts managed to break into the right-wing Twitter sphere. So there are two primary responses I got on this tweet. One is, oh, so now it's fascist to want clean streets, which is not at all what I said, but again, this is Twitter where nuance and honestly reading comprehension go to die. To me, it really says a lot about the frame of mind of people who would react to my hypothetical that way, that their first instinct is to be defensive about it. Street sweepers or fascism would actually be funny if any single one of these people were the type who would support increased taxes to bolster municipal services. The other primary response I got, besides being defensive about possibly being aligned with fascism, was yes, I would definitely make that trade-off, and furthermore, fascism is good. I'd like to believe these are people who are just trying to be edgy, but that's probably being too generous about the current state of our politics. Like, I'm sure the tiger smoking meme has some special significance, and I'm more than happy to remain blissfully unaware of what that is. So it's really a dead heat between people who imagine that I said wanting less trash is fascist and are offended by that, and people who think I'm really understating the benefits of fascism. Although some people want to haggle over the number, like 5% less trash is an absolute bargain for embracing fascism. There's also 3% guy, 3% plus goose-stepping guy, 2%, guy who will vote fascist for 1% less trash, very edgy. Although, is it really edgy when so many other original thinkers with blue checks are saying the exact same thing? Guy who doesn't even need a percentage, just a single piece of trash will do the trick. And of course, super edgelord who will vote fascist even if it means more trash on the street. I want to say it has to be so tiresome to be this kind of person, but I'm guessing some of them aren't actual humans. Although, maybe that's wishful thinking. There's a whole argument in here that's like, if the people running our cities can't keep them antiseptically clean, then how can we possibly expect people not to vote for fascism? I've been to just about all the supposed worst cities for this kind of thing, including San Francisco earlier this month, and it's just nonsense. It's funny, my original tweet was intended to engage urbanists, or if that word is too imprecise, just people who love cities. But most people who ended up in my mentions are people who not only just don't seem to like cities at all, but have to question whether they've actually ever been to one. Why is there so much trash? You know, the people on top of the Republican ticket literally went to Detroit and Minneapolis, and their pitch to those cities was, don't let the rest of this country become like your city. I don't know, I've been to Detroit and Minneapolis this year, and they're both fantastic. our cities will be forever stuck in a cycle of squalor and stagnation without fascism. Yes, famously, American cities completely bereft of innovation, creativity, and wealth creation under non-fascist rule. And man, these people just hate the Bay Area. Meanwhile, it's probably the epicenter of the world economy, and most of the problems it has stem from the fact that they can't build anywhere near enough housing for all the people who want to live there. Here's another theme. Why can't US cities be more like other world cities that are clean? First of all, if you've been to Paris, it's not much more or less clean than any big city, and try being there when there's a strike. Make no mistake, these people love to talk about what a third world hellhole Paris is with all the immigrants and the left-leaning government, right up until it's time to make a bad faith argument against American cities. Same guy also holds Singapore up as a shining example of global cities that we should model ours after, and he has some company. Guy who wants the caning penalty for people who ride their city bikes on the sidewalks. And this person has a whole philosophy. A large number of people living harmoniously in close proximity requires strict standards of order. Does it really? I've visited a lot of world cities, and I'll take New York's culture, food, and diversity over the cleanliness of a city like Singapore any day of the week. But I don't know, maybe you're a huge fan of that city-state's excessive penalties for littering and like chewing gum, and the human rights abuses that make Singapore's shiny, sterile version of urbanism possible in the first place. Something this guy went on at length about in a whole thread he quote tweeted me with. The number of people who actually posted something thoughtful that acknowledged the tension between, on the one hand, addressing urban disorder, and on the other hand, embracing a police state, was unfortunately outweighed by people who either didn't apply any critical thinking at all, or people who don't understand basic supply and demand principles. 90% of urbanism is trying to force everyone from the suburbs and the third world into the middle of the city in the hopes that it'll spur demand for construction and lower condo prices. Yes, housing prices definitely go down when there's more demand. You are very smart. Or people who just went right into talking about a completely different topic. Like, this person was already in the middle of saying something stupid and offensive and then started ranting about vaccines. Insert, sir, this is a Wendy's meme.
Here's another one of these clips. And he's debating about all the people on how the streets are having more trash, more problems. Now look, folks, things were better about 2 decades ago, and we did not have a more fascist system. In fact, I can argue that our establishment in the last 50 years has been taking us more to corporate fascism. Now, back in the day, Democrats who are overwhelmingly running these cities, they were more saner. Okay. In fact, Trump, what he's really seems like he's trying to do is try to take us back to the policies that we used to have, that we basically had more well-maintained cities. So all of this reaction is such full of lunacy. Now, I understand some aspects of the cities has improved. There are some benefits living in the inner cities and dense walkable areas. But then again, a lot of these so-called critics of CityNerd, or people who happen to be Trump supporters, you got to understand that either they're them or there could be moderates or whatever. You need to distinguish between the design of the cities and the condition. Okay, just because we attack and downgrade inner cities doesn't mean we're against the design aspect of the city. We're talking about the downward condition. And there's no doubt it's experienced loss of decline. Increased homelessness. It's just taking all over a lot of these city blocks. You've got these poor district attorneys that don't prosecute crime. So that makes walking, transit, and remember the Charlotte light rail incident with the Ukrainian immigrant, makes less safe. Even driving too, by the way. Taxes have gone up. We've seen the riots not just happening in Minneapolis recently or a lot of the inner cities, but even in around 2020, you look at the decline in culture. A lot of people are not a fan of these gender trends that's being pushed. Lack of religion. There's all these language barriers. Of course, demographics, all these things make a difference. People, a a lot of them prefer to live in more monoculture societies in places that are like them. Because he's talked about Singapore, believe it or not. All of these factors matter. Just look at Tokyo and Seoul. And by contrast, look at North America, Oceania, and Europe. They've experienced massive demographic change with massive immigration, and the cities a lot of them have lost their culture. It's created division. It's created a situation where people tend to kind of disaggregate in separate neighborhoods. Lack of trust. Then when you look at the massive store closures, the company exodus. Now, some of that, of course, is due to remote work, interest rates, but a lot of this has to do with the policies that's been going on to the inner cities. And of course, these guys want to keep saying, oh, we'll just move back to the inner cities. But look, folks, these cities are not as lively as much as they used to be. But this guy is continuously pushing these partisan agendas, and it's no wonder it's been about 35 years they've been trying to mitigate sprawl, but it hasn't gone to the point where their efforts are dominating. And sprawl is pretty much just disappearing to a mostly extent.
It's often said Twitter isn't real life, and that was always true, but it's even more true when your entire feed is full of accounts of questionable authenticity that pay $8 a month or whatever for a blue check and the privilege of having their idiotic commentary show up more prominently. And I think we're all more vulnerable to disinformation than we think we are, including me. So going back to the original topic, I'd just ask, is your perception of disorder in US cities rooted in objective reality? Or is it influenced by people who, mostly not in good faith, talk about it all the time? Like, some of the engagement I got was stuff I think would have gotten your account suspended in previous years, but now it's all just good fun on the free speech platform. I should post on Blue Sky. I do post on Blue Sky, and Threads, and Mastodon, and maybe more of that is in my future. But the engagement on those platforms is often kind of boring. I'm not looking for an echo chamber where everyone agrees with me all the time. I like some healthy disagreement and hearing perspectives from outside my own political, philosophical bubble, but that's not even what's going on the platform these days. I'm not even going to show you anywhere near the worst stuff I got. But this app is now not only platforming, but amplifying the most atrocious viewpoints. I'd like to believe I don't actually have fellow US citizens who think like this, that these accounts are all ops from rival nations that are undermining our democracy on the cheap, and/or they're bots. But again, probably wishful thinking. We're less than 9 months out from a very big election, but unfortunately, if you live in the vast majority of US states, your vote is going to have next to no impact at all at the top of the ticket. But what if you moved somewhere it did? So today I'm going to focus on swing states, what they are, why you should move to one, and I'm going to pinpoint cities and neighborhoods in swing states where you could live in a great urban environment for an affordable price. I mean, one wants to run a kleptocracy and pack the Supreme Court with Christian fundamentalists, and the other, I don't know, pass the biggest climate legislation in the nation's history. Okay, I've got 8 states for you, and let's start with Nevada. So for each state, I'm going to give you a big city urban location and a smaller city urban location for you strong towns types. My big city option here is zip code 89101, which is downtown Vegas. I just want to say that when I lived in the Vegas area in 2022, I'm pretty sure I was single-handedly responsible for getting Catherine Cortez Masto elected and establishing a 50+1 majority in the US Senate. You're all welcome. I lived in Henderson then, but I'm increasingly bullish on downtown Vegas, and if I had to do it all over again, which isn't out of the realm of possibility, that's probably where I'd look. It's got a nice grid, there's lots of housing infill, it's weird, it's a 24-hour environment, there are cool bookstores and record shops, funky converted motels and makers spaces, with a walk score of 93, access to tons of bus lines at Bonneville Transit Center, and a median rent just a bit over $1,000. It's really an intriguing location with lots of upside. My smaller city option has to be 89501, which is downtown Reno. Fair warning, the median price is based on only 22 listings in the zip code, so tread carefully. But this part of the city really does have some good bones.
Once again, supposedly, if you want to improve housing and transit, despite that Democrats don't really have that good of a track record, especially with cost, overspending on transit programs, despite the fact that a lot of people got frustrated from the aftermath of COVID, from the vaccines, lockdowns, the high cost of living that resulted from that, not to mention the low approval ratings of Obama and Biden, which led to the Trump victories a couple of times. This guy is still going to continue to pitch his partisan agenda. And during the 2024 election, he was advising people to move to these swing states in order to make sure that Kamala gets another term. Okay, this is really what he's trying to push out. And not to mention, Trump managed to get all of the swing states. Think about it. We go through all these policies, all these higher taxes, all of these NIMBY efforts. I mean, he's admitted this in the other videos I just covered, but yet he had the audacity. Now, remember, he just told you he lived in the Las Vegas area, okay? Now, for the record, of course, we do agree that the area is planned overall not so well, and there is tremendous infill opportunity in Las Vegas and Henderson. I'm working on a Henderson infill project, so actually I am trying to do the best I can, believe it or not. But he voted for her. This woman has never held a town hall. She keeps pandering to illegal aliens. She's a byproduct of the crooked Harry Reid machine, the senator before her, but we should still vote for these people despite their track records. Wow. Unbelievable. Now, I want to know what's his take on Trump's freedom cities he's talked about, because Trump has talked about urban planning issues, but believe it or not, this guy, Ray, has moved out of Nevada. So those of you who are quite frustrated and are Trump supporters, I don't think he's likely going to move out here and vote again.
That there's an extremely positive case that can be made that the Biden administration has been very, very good on a lot of the things that a lot of us care about. And that isn't what this video is about, but it's definitely something that just doesn't get talked about enough. For today, I'm only talking about the city and transportation aspects of what's in the Project 2025 document. And I think we're going to agree that those things are largely very bad, but it's just a small piece of what's in the overall document, which is full of all sorts of super enlightened stuff that's definitely aimed at making this a better country and not a Dark Ages white Christian nationalist ethno-state. I mostly want to talk about transportation here, but let's hit the chapter on housing and urban development really quick, because it crystallizes a big theme that runs through this whole document, which is the idea of getting rid of competent administrators and replacing them with partisan hacks. I mean, political appointees. It would be totally comical if it weren't so serious. I mean, think about your own job. Were you hired because you had beliefs that were sufficiently extreme so as to please your superiors? Or were you hired because you were actually qualified to do the job? Well, Project 2025 doesn't work like that. Actual policy recommendations? Congress should prioritize any and all legislative support for the single-family home. Not really shocking at all. And then within the same paragraph, American homeowners and citizens know best what is in the interest of their neighborhoods and communities. But also, a conservative administration should oppose any efforts to weaken single-family zoning. So citizens should decide what's best right up until the moment that they decide on something we don't like. Got it. All right, let's go to the heart of what I want to talk about in Chapter 19, the Department of Transportation. Fair warning, there's going to be a lot of just comically stupid stuff in here, but let's go ahead and start with what I think just might be the headline. The Department of Transportation's discretionary grant-making processes should be abolished, and funding should be focused on formulaic distributions to the states. So instead of funding DART or Cap Metro or Houston Metro, we're just going to send all the money to TxDOT and let them decide if they want to spend money on anything besides freeway widening projects. Doesn't seem problematic at all. They give two reasons why grants should be abolished. One, because we should really be moving away from a federal gas tax and toward quote-unquote user charges that affect the decisions of transportation system users. Man, I actually agree with all that, and it's actually exciting to see that Trumpers are totally pro-congestion pricing. Maybe Governor Hochul should read this. Second, if funding must be federal, it would be more efficient for the US Congress to send transportation grants to each of the 50 states and allow each state to purchase the transportation services that it thinks are best, which seems reasonable as long as you don't think about it too much. But the reality is there's a huge mismatch between where the political power is at the state level and where the actual population and economic productivity are, which is our big metro areas. You see this all the time in transportation decision making in every state, whether it's Texas or New York. And federal discretionary grant programs like what we've had under the Biden administration are just one part of rectifying that mismatch. I guess you could argue that there's no federal interest in making sure our cities, which are disproportionately responsible for the economic might of the nation, have appropriate transportation investments, but I've never heard a credible version of that argument. Let's go to a couple other things in this document that are just absolutely crazy making. When they start listing the quote-unquote pressing transportation challenges that most directly affect average Americans, number one on the list is the high cost of personal automobiles. Like, that's really what they see as problem one, despite the fact that driving is cheaper in the US than it is in practically any other developed country. And the only reason we spend so much on it is because we have such high vehicle miles traveled per capita, which is because we don't fund other transportation choices. Project 2025 is just full of circular, self-defeating logic like this. The language they have around equity, like acknowledging that transportation benefits and impacts tend not to be distributed in a just way, is pretty atrocious, and the hostility toward the whole concept of carbon emissions is as well, although it's not surprising, I guess. Safety. Project 2025 has a completely different conception of what transportation safety is compared to, people who actually study this stuff and know what they're talking about. Like, one tortured argument they make for why we should be rolling back regulations to make cars less expensive is because we want more people to buy more new cars because newer cars are safer. This is, how do I put this, a very auto manufacturer centric way of thinking about safety. The trends show that the new cars that people buy most often are safer for the people inside the vehicle and a lot less safe for the people outside the vehicle. Another winner. They hate that the Biden administration has embraced the concept of reducing roadway fatalities because it sometimes means slower vehicle speeds. Just in case you're wondering what these people's priorities are. Another area that's a real head scratcher is the whole section on corporate average fuel economy, or CAFE standards. They're upset because the standards the Biden administration put in place are hard to meet for internal combustion engine or ICE vehicles. I mean, this is kind of the point. You want to incentivize auto manufacturers to increase production of electric vehicles so you can meet the overall target. But the Project 2025 folks hate this because history shows people have a clear preference for ICE vehicles. Like, I can't say for sure that this whole section was literally written by an oil derrick, but they definitely get an F for data interpretation. Another thing that's comical is these people are all about devolving federal power down to the state level, right up until the moment California wants to do something even more climate friendly than what federal policy requires. So the section ends with two recommendations. One, reduce fuel economy targets to levels that can be met with ICE vehicles alone because electric vehicles are woke, I guess. And two, revoke California's ability to decide on its own targets because it's California. Real quick, I just want to point out that I'm focusing on what Project 2025 says, which is mostly pretty abhorrent, but it's important to recognize what it doesn't say. Like, there's basically no mention of road safety other than to complain that addressing it might require cars to go slower sometimes. And there's absolutely no mention of passenger rail of any kind at all, which would be a bit of a change in focus from the current administration. Can I just say, there isn't a single one of the world's great cities that could ever function adequately without public transit. Yet Project 2025's utter disdain for transit is palpable throughout Chapter 19. Transit investments mean, quote unquote, throwing good money after bad, so the best course of action would be to remove federal subsidies for transit spending. It's like these people have no understanding and not even any curiosity about how cities actually work.
Obviously, I am not too much of a fan of zoning, and I understand that single-family zoning can have a lot of issues. Nevertheless, the vast majority of the American people prefer detached homes, and I don't think it's an issue that America has a higher rate than other parts of the world, including Europe. Detached single-family homes is not necessarily a threat to traditional walkable transit-oriented development. We can see a lot of single-family dominated neighborhoods in the Northeast or in Chicago or wherever that are very walkable and transit-oriented. In fact, lot sizes here in Las Vegas are pretty compact and are very comparable to those older cities, which proves that detached homes are not really the heart of the problem. It's really non-residential areas. But really, what Trump is trying to do, and Project 2025 to an extent, is trying to counter the efforts of the Biden administration, such as the fact that it is an issue because you are pro-transit, and sure, we need it. However, when these projects in America can cost about 7 times more than other developed countries, it is an issue. And not to mention, highways can cost more and take longer than it should. Not to mention, a lot of people don't want these so-called housing and transit projects to be pushed for social justice, equity, climate change agenda. Now, then again, I think that Project 2025 does have issues, and of course it doesn't always align with the MAGA agenda, but then again, you talk about, you really try to lump these two in together. Trump, responding to your car standard agenda, from what I heard, he's trying to roll back many of the standards that prevents a lot of the smaller cars from getting in the road. Not to mention, you defended, it seems like, many of the California policies of many of their environmental programs, which a lot of these regulations can be very costly. It can be harmful to businesses and job creation. I mean, certainly we can improve the environment, improve mobility, but we don't have to do it through that level. And see, this is the thing. The environmental wing has really infiltrated, like I've mentioned before, the urbanist anti-sprawl movement. Then again, these programs can be implemented better at the local level instead of the federal level. Now, to be fair, okay, Trump isn't necessarily anti-transit. His administration supports the Bright Line train that's going to go from here in Las Vegas all the way to Southern California, 40 miles east of LA, Rancho Cucamonga, the city that I lived there for 13 years. And keep in mind, though, that Trump is a Manhattan guy, and I'm sure he knows that without the subways, Manhattan would be highly dysfunctional.
I'm in the process of moving to a swing state now, partially influenced by your swing states video, but in the event that we keep on this trajectory towards a Handmaid's Tale suburban hellscape, maybe you can suggest some cities for those of us who may choose to go the expat route. Handmaid's Tale? Let's not get hysterical. Although, maybe it isn't overreacting. I actually did what this viewer basically suggested, which was to attempt to submit my own application to the portal on the Project 2025 website, in the hopes of landing a high-level position in the new Republican administration. And the screening questions are amazing. These are all "do you agree with the following statements" questions, and you better choose the correct answers on systemic racism, the gender wage gap, and the foundational importance of family and religion. Before we get too far into this, a quick recap on how I deal with comments. The algorithm really does a pretty good job of sorting the highest value comments to the top of the feed. And what I do is Thursday morning every week, I read the top 10 comments and usually respond. I don't even bother reading the rest, which I assume get progressively stupider. This week was a major exception though, and I did read every single one of the over 4,000 comments I've received so far. And believe me when I say, this was not a plus for my sanity. And given my approach, it makes this one all the more confusing. Really, Ray? What's particularly sick about you deleting my comment is that I'm a vote blue no matter who guy this election cycle. Still, I care about the truth. So I obviously didn't even read your comment, much less delete it, so I'm thinking skill issue? Okay, the first subset of comments I want to talk about is people who basically agree with me but added some nuance that I probably missed. For example, I do think I have a tendency to dance around the edges of whatever it is I'm talking about, so it's nice to have viewers just be really direct about it. The thing about Project 2025 is that it benefits no one but the rich and conservative, but far more than the 1% will unknowingly vote for it. That's why it's our job to help educate people. We may be stupid, but at least we can be informed. And with that, I think I just found the new tagline for this channel. On the topic of the document's recommendation to cancel all federal grant programs and just send all the money directly to the states, which really is a bedrock small government conservative idea, I felt like I did a decent job of explaining why that's a big mistake, but this viewer brought up the example I wish I had thought of, which is the Mississippi state government taking millions in federal welfare money to build a volleyball stadium for Brett Favre's kid, including $1 million that went right into Favre's pocket. I'm pretty sure that's the exact opposite of welfare, and the underlying point here is state legislatures by their nature are often even more disproportionately rural-leaning than the US Senate and the Electoral College, so devolving power to states is, in most cases, even more retrograde than the system we have now. Mixed feedback on the segment on public transit. Again, maybe I'm bad at stating the obvious, but this viewer had no such problem. I have this horrible feeling that the redefinition of public transit could also be there to open the door to privatization of our existing public transit systems. And I think that is the correct takeaway, but also, I don't usually venture into the liberal echo chamber, but y'all should realize that most people don't want more public transportation, and most people don't want to live in dense urban areas. I'm not going to say there isn't a liberal echo chamber, but I think we should all at least be able to agree on some basic facts. Way more Americans live in large metro areas than don't, and the most expensive, meaning highest demand parts of those metro areas are the dense inner neighborhoods. It is 2024 and you just can't escape being in some kind of echo chamber, but you can at least be in one that values factual information. I got several comments along the lines of, Project 2025 is all about speedrunning us into becoming a third world country. I'm an Iranian and I can tell you that Project 2025 would imitate the Iranian regime by making decisions based on policy, ideology, and corruption rather than logic.
Basically, as you can see, more of the same agenda, more of his partisan push, and yeah, he makes some good points. Sure, there's a lot of demand to live in the inner cities, hence their higher prices, their premium in these dense urban areas. But the comment about Iran, wow, that really grabbed my attention. I mean, first of all, yeah, you can say Project 2025 and the Iranian regime have similarities. You know, maybe they put things in a more moral perspective, but they're vastly different from one another. Okay. When it comes to the Heritage Foundation, their perspective is more about the Constitution, about what this country used to do, higher levels of economic freedom. But then again, these people can be so harsh and they can kind of pitch their cultural agendas. This CityNerd channel.
Probably not these people who I'm guessing are just straight up trolls who I assume not only haven't read Project 2025, but don't care what's in it because the only thing that actually matters is that it makes the people they don't like mad. But some people are legitimately pro Project 2025. If you want strong urbanism, you have to have a high-trust society. If you want a high-trust society, you have to have secure borders and some amount of cultural homogeneity. Is this guy an urbanist? Because I kind of get the feeling he's just never been to a city. Also, a guy who doesn't see it as a problem if DC gets overrun by a bunch of Charlie Kirk wannabes because Charlie Kirk actually has the correct views on everything. The most interesting comments really are the ones that are from people who just flat out disagree with me, because the things they say are just so revealing about how their brains work. Like, instead of blocking my channel, just don't watch it and the algorithm won't show it to you anymore. It's not that hard. Some of the comments are nearly indecipherable, but I'll try to be generous. I have actually read Project 2025, and all you have said about it is absolutely wrong. Your channel is Democrat misinformation. Also, no credible sources. So apparently we've reached the point where disinformation is defined as someone reading verbatim passages from the primary document itself, which is basically what my video was. Just brilliant. To be clear, 100% of your video is opinion. I agree with some points, but just because you say it doesn't make it true. We need to see an equally opinionated opposite view for fairness. You are sick and demented, and you'll get what's coming to you. And by the way, which vax booster are you on? Inflation is 7%. You do realize you can just Google this stuff, right? Although the Wall Street Journal is a noted leftist propaganda rag. And I just prayed for insults about soy, but instead I get fiber. 2 points about this. One, these people are just really losing their edge. And two, I can assure all of you that I am very, very regular. There was just shockingly little criticism of the actual substance of what I said in the video. More often, people just didn't like the way I said it. Posh liberal accent, opinion discarded. I've never had my speaking style described as posh, ever, so I'll take it. This guy sounds like an AI bot. You guys, I would not wish my rhetorical style on anyone, much less a computer. There was actually a lot of constructive criticism about my presentation style, though. You made some good points, but half the video was filler with monotone insults. Keep it more professional and you'll get more traction. One, you're obviously new here, and two, you must really be enjoying today's video. 5 minutes into a 20-minute video and nothing of value has been said. I want information about the plan, not your thoughts on appointed judges or that calling the project a different name would be more accurate in your opinion. I was gonna respond to this, but it seems like one of my viewers has it under control. So let's talk about what I think was the most often repeated criticism I got. And it's this idea that Project 2025 is just ideas from a random think tank and not stuff Trump is actually going to do, despite how much of the Heritage Foundation's 2016 document got implemented during Trump's first go-around. And yes, I did point that out in the video. But it's like these people live in a world where the campaign promises of a guy who lies constantly carry more weight than his actual track record from the first time he held the job. It's Democrat propaganda. Nobody on the right knows anything about it. Yes, something that was literally written by the kind of conservatives who have been massively influential in Republican politics for nearly half a century is actually propaganda from the other side. Now I feel really stupid for not having realized that. Besides, did you know Trump is actually an urbanist? According to a guy who's active in the Michigan Republican Party who also thinks I should try being more like strong towns because they aren't patronizing, and furthermore, did I know that Trump is against sprawl actually? So you can like my style or not like my style, but there are something like a billion other videos on the platform that you could be watching. So it's a bit of a you problem if you're still here. At the same time though, I don't mind criticism. Good criticism makes this a better channel, but if you're trying to tone police, just keep in mind, there are a lot of different ways to reach persuadable people. And I did get a few comments like this one, which I think are maybe the ones I like the most. I really don't understand why walkable cities and good transport need to be a partisan issue. This is a massive loser move from the Republican Party, which puts me in a tough spot since I also don't like the Democrats either. Even my boomer dad, who watches Fox News every night, started to complain to me about NIMBYs and wishes the suburb he lives in was more walkable. I voted for Trump in 2020, but a lot of Project 2025 is way too radical for my taste. Okay, I lied. There is actually one other significant area where I took a lot of heat.
And look, he just showed one of the comments because I'm a local chapter leader of Strong Towns Las Vegas, and it just shows that a lot of Strong Town members can lean more Republican. And Charles Marone just doesn't really buy into the whole partisan agenda with the climate change and everything. There's a lot of GOP voters that agree with a lot of what me and, well, Ray from CityNerd really talks about. The issue is, again, the way he pitches his idea, he scares a lot of people away. It makes you think what's going to be going along in the future. What's the whole plan? Because how are we going to be able to change the status quo in urban planning when you are pushing your partisan agenda? Now, maybe there could be counter movements that will continue to grow. The truth will get out. Maybe more and more of those MAGA types, moderates, will jump on board. Maybe there will be a non-Democrat Party approach to urbanism. We'll have to see. But then again, I don't think this guy is actually helping our cause, and it's your job to spread the information and word to make sure we have a brighter future. Now, before I go, despite the criticism I've given of CityNerd, this segment that he did about 15 cities, I will have to give him a lot of credit because he's made a lot of criticism of Las Vegas, its street design, stroads, and not to mention in this part where he talks about Las Vegas has density comparable to Portland. The homes are full of tiny lot homes, one of the highest dense areas in the country, and yet it's one of the most car-dependent areas in the nation.
Sprawling, car-dependent Las Vegas, population of about 640,000 in the city proper, which works out to a density of around 4,500 people per square mile. And progressive urban utopia of good planning and sustainable transportation, Portland, Oregon, about 650,000 in the city, and a density of about 4,900 people per square mile. Wow. And here's the city where I'm living now, at least temporarily, Valencia, Spain, about 790,000 in the city proper, and a density that's 3 or 4 times that of Portland or Las Vegas. Keep in mind, all 3 of these are the central cities of metro areas that are 2 to 2.5 million people. So this is very apples to apples. I am really